really, really drives me is helping people to sort out their admin headaches. And having had a lot of my own admin headaches in every type of organization, it doesn't matter if you're a tiny team or working in a massive organization, there are always issues with internal processes and managing data and, getting things done. And I think that's what we really, are focused on at ToucanTech, how we make it a product that's easy to use.
Welcome to the Independent School Podcast. Thinking and acting strategically is the key to both securing the future of your school and helping to build a more equal and just world. My name's Juliette Corbett. I'm a consultant, speaker and facilitator specialising in helping independent schools. In this podcast, I translate tried and tested strategy and fundraising techniques into a language that works for schools. So if you're a senior leader in a private school and you want your daily work to feel less exhausting and more strategic, and if you want once more to feel the joy of making the world a better place through education, then you're in the right place. Welcome, and let's get started on this week's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm delighted to be joined by Kate Jillings, the co-founder of ToucanTech, a community engagement software specifically designed for schools. Kate and I, in our conversation this week, cover all things about online communities. So we talk about how important it is to future-proof your school community by ensuring that you have a destination where your community can meet, whether it be alumni, parents, donors, former staff, and so on. And it's increasingly important that you have a permanent home for these people online. And in our conversation, we talk about the trends that are occurring within the sector, particularly those that have been accelerated during COVID, which have made this more and more important. And then most importantly, we talk about the how. How can you best create a permanent online home for your community? And the key here, I think, is about being able to, even if you only have a small team, create consistent, engaging content. And we talk quite a lot about some really good top tips around how you can create that content in a consistent manner, even with a small team. And it's also about making it as easy as possible internally for you to streamline your workflows and make sure that you have the data that you need to analyse what people in your community are interested in, so that you can serve them more of what they really want to engage with. Just briefly before we dive into that conversation with Kate, a little bit more about her background. So she is one of the co-founders of the community management software ToucanTech, which was created specifically for school development teams. She's previously led marketing teams at GlaxoSmithKline and at BNP Paribas, and she's founded B-School media platform Business Because. She was also on the board of a fintech company called True Rating, and she's an advisor to startups, including eco-laundry chain Blanc, and she's the trustee of an HIV educational charity. And one of the first questions I ask her is about how she has taken all of these varied experiences and put them to best use in her work with ToucanTech. Before we dive into the detail, I wanted to let you know about a free resource I've created to help you prepare your school for the coming economic impact of the invasion of Ukraine. It's a checklist of things you need to think about and take action on now, and it's designed to prompt strategic conversations around the issues that actually matter. You can download your free copy at www.consultjuliette.co.uk/checklist. Okay, now let's continue with this week's episode. So I hope you enjoy listening to my conversation with Kate. So hello, Kate, and welcome to the Independent School Podcast.
Hi, Juliette. I'm really happy to be here this morning.
Fantastic. So your career prior to founding ToucanTech has been really varied. You've done all sorts of different things. And then you landed on the idea, I guess, of community kind of management software for schools. I'd love to know what drew you into the education sector and if there are any lessons from those jobs that you had prior to ToucanTech that have enabled you to kind of accelerate the growth of your company.
Sure. Well, immediately before running ToucanTech, I was actually running a community-based software product, but for the higher ed sector. So my business partner, Sean, and I had previously built an online media product for business schools, and we were sharing the stories of business students around the world. And we worked with a lot of top business schools, from Stanford to London Business School to schools in Asia. So we'd had some experience in higher ed, and actually it was from working in that particular business that we started creating the idea of ToucanTech, because we'd spoken, in fact, to a lot of alumni managers in the business schools who'd said to us, oh, we'd love our own online platform or news content area to be able to stay in touch with our alumni and share their stories and connect them. And that made us think about creating a software product that could be white labeled and used across the education sector. We then went back and talked to our old secondary schools, and the idea morphed from there. And it's really just kind of grown organically in the years that followed. But way back before that, I did have a very varied career. I worked in big corporates. I worked on a equity derivatives trading floor, actually, when the financial crisis was spiraling. I worked in a pharmaceuticals company. I've also been on the board of a fintech company and involved in various charitable projects. So quite wide-spanning experience, which has been really helpful in terms of how we've then gone on to build the ToucanTech product and making it really useful for different types of customers that might need to use it in different ways.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things actually is drawing on all those experiences that we have in our prior life and making sure that we're making the most of them in what we're doing now. And even those people who I speak to on this podcast who have been teachers all their life, they often talk about kind of other projects that they've been involved in that have influenced the way that they teach and the way that they approach education. I think it's really important that we're open to those other ideas, isn't it?
Definitely. And I think something that really, really drives me is helping people to sort out their admin headaches. And having had a lot of my own admin headaches in every type of organization, it doesn't matter if you're a tiny team or working in a massive organization, there are always issues with internal processes and managing data and, getting things done. And I think that's what we really, are focused on at ToucanTech, how we make it a product that's easy to use.
Yeah, I often talk about efficiency, meaning kind of the smoothing out those admin headaches behind the scenes, and effectiveness in the sense that it actually succeeds in achieving the goals that you have. And I think once you combine the two, that's when you're onto a winner, isn't it? Because people actually want to use it if it's easy to use, both from the audience point of view and from the internal point of view. It's effective and efficient.
Definitely.
Yeah. So we are, every time I say this, I've got my fingers crossed, we are hopefully coming through the COVID pandemic. And it's an opportunity, I think, a lot of us to be reflecting back on the last couple of years and thinking about the trends that we've been seeing. And generally speaking, it's been an acceleration of the previous trends that we saw prior to COVID hitting. And one of those has definitely been the importance of really authentic and high quality online communities, that this isn't anymore something sort of optional. It is actually a really essential part of building an engaged community of people. What was your couple of years like? Have you seen trends and seen the data behind the scenes to evidence this growth of online communities?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the trend was moving in that way anyway, but COVID sort of accelerated everything. And particularly in the school sector, the entire schools industry has had to go through this seismic shift of making sure they have a digital strategy and that everything can be communicated online sort of in parallel within the classroom. And that's not to say that online, I think, will ever fully replace in person. I think post-COVID, we've all realized how much we love being back in person. But I think twin tracking what you're doing in the physical world with some sort of online home is really important. And I also think that people don't want to shift back to fully in person. I think there's always the opportunity, particularly for certain age groups or people that may live remotely, to have that connection via an online means. And I mean online in the broadest sense. So community is a sort of quite a vague term, right? We're not necessarily saying that it's important to have a portal or somewhere that people log in and are active each day. I think online community to me means just being able to communicate with people, whether it's via email, via a website, via a place where they know to go to. Potentially you're using your social feeds really effectively and people know that that's where they get updated. It's just about having a plan and being able to generate the right content and share your stories sort of online as well as on your site.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's about focusing in on the things that are right for your community, isn't it? So it might mean a lot of, a really good email kind of journey that you take people on through the year. And that's what people want. That's great. You might combine that with a social media platform or two. But if you try and do everything, you're just diluting, aren't you, what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah, I mean, and you asked, yes, you're right. Dilution is a problem for all of us, isn't it? Because we all try to do too much. And that's something I've definitely had a lot of people complain about during COVID.
Yeah.
It's almost like their to-do list got bigger. I mean, you asked about what we saw that was different. And we saw a huge increase in email volumes going out via ToucanTech servers. Well, not 10% more emails to bigger recipient lists. But that actually led to nearly a 30% uplift in the volume of email opens in 2020 versus the year before, which was kind of prior to COVID. So that was quite noticeable to us. And we also saw schools publishing a lot more online news. So I think schools sort of took a slightly paternalistic view and started sharing a lot of content to support their wider communities, whether it was tips around staying healthy or how to stay connected when you're in lockdown, and just were publishing more content. So 42% more online news in 2020 amongst the sort of 50 schools that we were monitoring for that. And that's also, I think, continued in a certain way. We've seen with this latest horrible situation in Ukraine, a lot of schools have taken that position of, being responsible for their communities and sharing ideas about how to support the efforts in Ukraine, and maybe sharing stories of any connections that they've got with Ukrainian families and so forth. And it's been useful to have some form of online website or community to be able to do that, and it not just all being on the main school website.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that way you can tailor your message to different audiences, because the main school website normally is mostly a marketing tool for potential parents. And so to know that there's actually a way that you can tailor the news for each element of your community is really important. And the way that you communicate with alumni is quite different from the way you communicate with parents, potentially. So to be able to have the system to enable you to customize that content, really important.
Yes, absolutely key. They are really different audience groups. And there'll also be a segment who are parents and alumni, which is quite common. Or parents and alumni and have some other relationship with the school, like being a local business or a governor. So you can segment into lots of different subsegments within your audience groups. And some of the news and events and activities are applicable to everyone, and some need to be really tailored. So yes, I absolutely agree.
I think what you mentioned before about kind of twin tracking the online and the real in-person communications that people are having, I think is really going to be the way that we go forward, isn't it? That this kind of hybrid world in which we're now living is actually more complicated to manage, but it has a greater response rate from people in terms of people actually engaging with the communities, I think.
Yeah, certainly. I've seen a lot of reunion events take place where there's been an online and a physical option. My school have done one, Lady Eleanor Hollis, and they had a physical reunion back in school, but they also had an online Zoom meet where people from different class years could meet and talk to each other as well, and with a sort of repository page of content for people to view. So I think it's a great opportunity actually to sort of make more of your events, because you are extending your reach beyond just the people that physically come on site. And often you're creating the information and the stories and the content anyway, and taking the photos and stuff. So you may as well do that additional step to share it online.
Yeah, absolutely. And it enables more people to get involved in some way that suits them, especially given how geographically diverse our alumni communities are. That's really important for increasing participation in these events. So definitely this isn't a trend that's going to go away. We've seen, as you've mentioned, schools using a combination of the online and in-person events around the Ukraine crisis as well, and kind of uplifting communications around that. One of the things I've heard you mention before is the idea of having a permanent online home for your multiple communities. I think that's the key to it all, isn't it? It's the idea of you've got a permanent place online where people can gather. Why do you think that's so important? What is it that's sort of innate in our human nature or our human communities that actually now need this permanent online home?
I think part of it is just that it's more pragmatic, right? I think there's lots of stuff that people can find on the web, and we're all bombarded with emails. And your relationship with your old school, or if you're even a parent and your relationship is very regular in terms of like almost daily contact, it's just easier if there's one place where you know to go. And it can be quite confusing if you receive multiple emails. There might be social posts, there might be different websites, there might be different pages buried within a school website. So I think it can help if you've got a community and you tell people about it, and it's got a nice URL like community.school.com or hub.school.com, and it's where people know that they can bookmark that URL in their browser, and they can go back there if they're looking for information about an upcoming reunion event or progress with a fundraising campaign, or even just to scout around to see the latest updates from the school. It's just, in practical terms, I think it makes it easier, particularly if you build that over time, and these communities can have a lot of longevity. And as you add more content and more stuff happens, then they become more populated. So I think it's a practical thing. I think it's just easier to have somewhere that's bookmarked and easy to find. And I do think there is something innate about people wanting that kind of connection. I think people feel more cared for if they know that there's somewhere that's dedicated to them and that the school wants to communicate with them on a dedicated platform in that way.
Yeah, and it also gives you the chance to customize it, to kind of set the tone, if you like, for that particular part of your community. So thinking through your audience, the tone that you're going to set, the type of content, the frequency, I guess you can do whatever you want. I mean, some of these could be quite business focused in terms of kind of alumni careers type things. Some of them could be quite fun, quite informal. I guess setting that in advance and knowing what you want it to feel like for people is part of the creation process.
Definitely. I love that you've made this point, because we see such a range of different communities, and actually sometimes it's quite unpredictable. I start talking to a school and you think that they're going to be just creating quite a traditional alumni community, the old scholars, the old society, whatever. And then actually, as the idea morphs, they turn it into a school-wide forum, and they incorporate content for parents, even for former staff. It's really important to stay in touch with staff that have got such a strong emotional connection to the school, and often they'll have lots of relationships with former students and parents as well, and local businesses. So we do have a whole range of examples. We've got schools that are running very widely encompassing communities, and they welcome everyone to join, and they post different content. They tend to be quite busy, populated websites. And then we've got very small niche communities that might just be, slightly smaller. They'll have less content on the minibar, they'll have less information, but they'll be more focused on a specific purpose, like a careers microsite or a specific fundraising campaign, or like you mentioned, a kind of business focused careers networking, business directory type site. And you can also run several of these, by the way. You can just link them together in an efficient way. They can all look fairly similar, so they're part of the same school's brand, but have a slightly different purpose, connected with each other. And we've got a school actually in Australia who are running an alumni portal alongside their main school website, as well as a parent portal, and they're all branded quite similarly, and they're all interlinked. And a parent who is also an alum can log in with the same login to multiple places. But the school's pushing out slightly different content, obviously, that's relevant to each of those groups.
And that's the key, isn't it? Making sure it's relevant to each audience as well. And I think the other thing that I see so frequently is that, generally speaking, independent schools, much actually like Oxford and Cambridge, where I worked before, they're pretty formal to start with. And actually, I think that, generally speaking, try and lose some of that formality. You need to be human. You don't necessarily need to be going full out humour, but there needs to be some element of fun and light humanity to this as well. So I think a lot of schools maybe start out thinking it needs to just be very, very formal, very sort of structured in its approach, but actually the more that you can make it a bit more spontaneous, I think the more people really engage with it. Is that something that you've seen as well?
Yes, and it's also just easier and faster to share information if you're not trying to write something that's perfect and gets approved and signed off by 10 stakeholders before you publish everything. So absolutely, and we see this time and again with schools. They really want to make everything very official looking and perfect on their websites. But I think the benefit actually of having a separate community that's not your main school website is that you can be a little bit more relaxed about that content. You can encourage volunteers to write. You can try and get people to post information, and sure, you can tidy up and edit it. But the more engagement you have with more people sharing their stories, generally the better. And it's true that the funnier stuff does get more reads and spreads, right? That's human nature. We see it on social all the time. So I agree. Look, I do talks on this actually, how you create a buzz online. And one of the key things is making your content fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes it takes a bit of guts to go in that direction, but it's so worth it. It really is. And it's I think what is interesting to me is that we're seeing more and more businesses, like full-on traditional businesses, going this way, and schools have a bit of a shortcut there because you're full of young people who are really good at this kind of youthful, energetic fun. So yeah, this is definitely a kind of a trend I think that we should be hopping on to as schools. So that segues really nicely into my next question. So we know that we want to have permanent online homes for all of our communities that we have as part of our schools. But the next big question is how? And I think the key word here is building permanence. And if you're going to try and build permanence, I think that there's a combination of consistently engaging content, and the consistency is really important, engaging content, and making it easy internally. So first of all, I wonder if you've got any tips on how to, as a small team, make sure you can build in generating really consistent and engaging content into a team's kind of weekly workflow. What are your thoughts around this?
That's a really good question, because lots of schools do have very small teams to generate this type of content. And we get asked so many times, like, how am I going to find the time to write an alumni newsletter? I do think part of it is a mindset rather than necessarily a real barrier. And part of it is a sort of personality type, right? So there are some of us who find it easier just to write quick emails or send a few paragraphs of content, post something on a website, and others who take more time to generate written stuff. So I think having someone in your team who is quite happy to spend half an hour a week writing something that's quick and, like you say, fun for your website helps. And it probably is a good idea that they diarize that so that it's actually a formal part of their weekly schedule and not just something that they have to do that's at the end of their to-do list and it never seems urgent, so it never gets done. I think something else that really helps, and we've seen this across a lot of schools, is to have some design template. So, and actually design, again, in the broadest sense, that it could be not just the actual design, so the sort of image style or the colors, but actually the format of the content you're posting. So do you have a simple Q&A format? Do you have guidelines, for example, for your interviewees if they do a news story with you about how to send in their photo and their headshot and stuff? So having all this templated in a way that can just be rolled out on a weekly or a monthly basis is really helpful and saves time. Something else I'd say is you can line up content in advance. So if you don't want to do half an hour a week, you could just block out an afternoon each month and try and collate it all then, and then you just line it up. And a tool we have on ToucanTech is that you can schedule your news stories or schedule your emails to go out in advance. So you could kind of do all of that work and then literally schedule it to go out. It's not going to be that kind of immediate news, but then I think a lot of this community management in the school sector isn't, it's not like Twitter. You're not trying to respond to everything on a daily basis. You're trying to produce this longevity and more of a kind of consistent flow of information and stories for your community to engage with. So that's another technique you could do to put aside half a day and produce it then. And then I'd say getting volunteers involved. And yes, it takes time to manage those volunteers, but if you invest a bit of time up front, then hopefully that will pay off in the year ahead. So if you can find a few people, whether it's an enthusiastic parent or, maybe a younger alum who wants a writing career, that's always, or it's sort of an aspiring journalist, that's a great way to encourage them to get published bylines on a website that will have an authoritative URL. It's a nice opportunity for people to write and have their stuff published somewhere that's going to be read. And school news tends to get fairly high readership rates, not necessarily high volumes, but definitely high percentages in terms of open rates. I mean, we see well over 50% open rates on the email newsletters that go out by ToucanTech
really
servers.
High.
And I mean, last month, nearly 400,000 people were sent email newsletters via ToucanTech servers. This is a big body of people that are receiving content and information from their schools. So it is a nice opportunity if you've got people that enjoy writing. I think you just need to probably find them and not feel like you have to do it all yourself all of the time.
I love every single one of those tips you shared. And what I love is that those are the sorts of things that I often talk to people about when they tell me exactly the same question as, how am I going to find time to do this consistently? The templates and the workflows that go behind this are really important, aren't they? To make sure there's some consistency in the output, but also just to make it faster and easier to generate when you're short of time. Blocking out time and doing it in advance is so important. And I always think that you can actually have some content that you've got scheduled out potentially even months, especially if it's some kind of archival content that you want to go out specifically in, I don't know, June, because it's archival around your cross-country run that happens every June or whatever it might be. You can schedule that back in November if you want to. You've got time.
Sure.
And also some thought pieces that aren't time sensitive as well. So I think there's a massive opportunity for getting teachers to write parenting advice or educational advice for alumni, because even if those alumni aren't necessarily going to be potentially sending their kids to your school, a lot of them have got kids, and that's your school's raison d'etre is really high quality kind of thinking and understanding behind some of these really challenging areas.
Yeah, I totally agree.
And so although not all of your alumni will have kids of the right age, there's a good proportion that will click on that each month. So, and again, that's not time sensitive, so you can schedule that well in advance. And often it emerges from workshops you might be doing for your own current parents anyway. So the content relatively straightforward.
That is a really good point. I think often you're doing stuff that is creating good content, and you just need to remember to share it in as many places as possible. So this idea of one interesting piece of content and then sharing it in multiple places,
definitely.
Again, that's kind of a mindset and a process thing, right? You've got all this great stuff happening within your campus, and sometimes you just need to remember to shout about it in the outside world. And like a lot of parents still can't go into school, right? So actually they are really starved of that interaction, and maybe the weekly newsletter isn't enough, and it's nice for them to have more information on a website or more opportunities to find stuff. And teachers tend to be great writers. The head at my kids' school, so my kids are at an international school just outside of Lisbon in Portugal, and it's a fairly new school, so it doesn't really have any alumni yet, but the parents are very active and very, very involved in the school, and the head sends a very sort of witty email each week, and I've always thought it would be lovely if some of those excerpts could be saved for the future or repackaged and turned into top tips and future content, because otherwise you read the email and then it's kind of gone, and a lot of that effort into writing it has been dispersed. And
to keep it as evergreen content as well, because email tends to be quite ephemeral. It disappears into your inbox and that's it, it's gone. Whereas I love
that idea, evergreen content. I'm going to steal that term.
So it's something that, again, this is going back to our very first question. This is something that is done very frequently in the business world. It's dividing up your content into evergreen content that you can actually recycle potentially multiple times over a number of years, because it actually has longevity. It doesn't date. It's designed specifically not to date. But then the way that you share it is to then tie it to something which is a bit more current. So you tie it to something that's happening at the moment in your school calendar or in the world more generally. But the actual content you're sharing could be shared again next year without having to create new content. And it's really important to have some of that in your calendar, your content calendar, as well as stuff that kind of is more ephemeral, that comes and goes. The other thing that I've learned from the business world I use, and I think is fantastic, is cascading your content. So for every long form piece of writing that you do, so for example, in a newsletter or a magazine, an online magazine, you've got a longer article, you can very easily chop that up into perhaps 4 LinkedIn posts, because LinkedIn tends to be a little bit longer. Potentially that could be divided up into many, many tweets, depending on how skilled you are at this, because the tweets obviously are much, much shorter. And thinking about actually every time you produce one piece of long form content, how can you chop that up into multiple shorter forms of content without having to actually start from scratch again? And what I love about that technique is it tends to drive traffic back to your original long form content, which means in the sense of an online community, driving people back to that destination you've created for them.
Yeah.
Whether it's a portal or an open website.
I think there's a tendency to put everything into your emails, right? And then the emails become very long, and you do get the statistics of what people are reading the emails, but you don't necessarily get them to click through and have that natural browsing around to find other things and capturing more data. So it's certainly a tip that we say, like, think of your emails as teasers.
Yes.
And pull the people back into a website. You don't have to force them necessarily to log in, but at least then they're being pulled into that longer form content like you suggest. And then you're being able to capture more information about what they're reading, where they're browsing around, and then hopefully enticing them, for example, to download something, which again is a great data capture point.
Yeah.
And whilst they're looking for something, maybe they then see an opportunity to sign up to an event, or they see some information about fundraising plans, or they see a story about someone that they want to connect with, and it just helps to kind of drive that wider engagement.
Yeah, and it's that spontaneous journey that they can take following their own interests that allows them to be in control of the content that they're consuming, which I think is really important as well.
Yeah, and I think data capture, I mean, I've touched on it now, but it is such a huge topic for schools, particularly alumni and development teams. And I wouldn't underestimate how important it is to use your communities and your content to be constantly capturing what we call behavioral data.
Yes.
So we all know what age for our communities, when people left school, we know the dates of birth of most of our communities, we know where they live, and we, all of that kind of demographic data tends to be fairly well stored in databases, some better than others, but being able to capture behavioral data alongside that is what makes your data really powerful long term when you want to try and understand who is more engaged with the school and who might be interested in approaches for fundraising. So yeah, I think if that's the ultimate goal for a lot of development officers, then getting people back onto your site and capturing information about them that's going into a database record is really, really important.
100%. I love that you've anticipated my next question. So one of the things I was going to say was that going back to trends that we're seeing happen in the big wide world, one of them is data, the importance of data driving the way that our world now works. Now, that can sound to some people quite boring and to other people quite sinister. It doesn't have to be either. Data actually enables you to provide the information that people are interested in reading. So assuming you've got all the right privacy policies and data practices in place and all the rest of that kind of stuff, then those behavioral patterns enable you to deliver what people are most interested in back to them in more quantity. So you can see what the click-through rates are, you can see what people are reading, and then generate more content of that type because that's what people are interested in. Just as you would do that for your events, you wouldn't continue to run an event that only has 3 people signed up for a decade every single year. You don't want to be producing content that very few people are consuming. So having that data and understanding where people are interested is really important. But even more important than that, I think this connection through to fundraising is really critically important. As charitable fundraising organizations, we have to use our resources efficiently. It's kind of ethically, it's really important that we're being as efficient as possible. And one of the ways that we can do that is by using those behavioral data patterns to predict who our future donors are going to be, so that when we're making calls and when we're contacting people, we've got a sense that, okay, in our community, normally the people who open the emails, read a certain amount of content each month, engage in social media, et cetera, as well as attending events, tend to be good predictors of who our donors are going to be.
Yeah.
It makes it
Well,
really
I mean,
obvious. That's where you focus your efforts.
Sure. And that is factual. I mean, we've run huge analysis on this. And in our 2020 big data report, we saw that 75% of donors were also opening emails from the school. I mean, maybe that seems obvious, but I think it's worth stating that, people who are donating do tend to be the people that are engaged with you. We saw that the proportion of donors is 12 times higher amongst those people who are opening emails and attending events than those who don't. That's quite a marked difference. Mm-hmm. And I think if you look at that backwards and you're trying to identify groups of people to approach, to talk to about fundraising, then you need to have that behavioral data in a filterable database that you can look at to decide, right, who am I going to go and talk to initially? And it doesn't necessarily need to be the obvious stuff either. I think something that I've noticed in the last few months when I've been checking our stats being pulled off the ToucanTech service is that there's some quite interesting patterns in terms of other engagement activities like an online shop or downloads of magazines or views of photos and stuff. And I think the shop in particular is fascinating because most of the shops hosted by ToucanTech schools on our communities are selling school merchandise, so branded ties or paintings of the school. And you have to imagine that if someone is purchasing these items, then they have a positive warmth, right? They have an affinity to the school. So to me, having that data neatly within those people's database records so that in a few years' time, when you're looking back, I'd like to look at everyone who's purchased a school tie. Yes. And maybe we create some specific campaign that they're interested in, and maybe they want to turn that purchase into a regular donation or something that's, linked in some way to receiving school memorabilia. I think Pangbourne College, I was having a look at their stats, they sold £4,500 of shop merchandise last month in March. And many of our schools are seeing similar figures. I know Bishop Stortford have a fantastic shop. Bradfield College have a great shop. A lot of these online shops are a really interesting engagement tool. As long as you're keeping that data in the same database that you're using for fundraising, which is not always the case. Yeah,
and it's being able to then use that data. And when you're making the case for why this is worth your time, and I have to say, I've run a kind of shops for merchandise pre all of these online communities, and it's very time consuming. But if you can make it efficient in this way, then it's another reason for doing it. It's collecting further information about which people are engaged and how they're engaging with the school. It's really important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you could actually sell online stuff. So I think probably in a lot of these cases, the schools had shops and those shop processes set up. And then it's just a case of making sure that the purchasing system and the data is all going through to the same database so that you're not running it as a completely separate part of the school. But if you don't have a shop set up, but you're interested in capturing that type of behavioral data, then you could sell access to online downloads or online courses, or get a very well qualified member of your parent or alumni base to record something useful online, like parenting tips or some kind of legal advice or anything that you think would be of value to your community, and you could actually get people to potentially purchase that online with that data going into there. So I think there's lots of innovative ways you can think around how you capture data and engage people and monetize different parts of your community.
Yeah, and I think as well, thinking back to making sure you've got all the data practices in place that are compliant, but also the ethics of it as well. I think as long as it's really clear what you're using data for, it makes the whole process more efficient, and it means you can deliver what people are interested in. So I know some people are quite skeptical of this area, but I think actually looking at the worldwide trend, the global trend we're seeing towards the importance of data, I think it is an area that schools can be much more focused on with real benefits.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So rounding our conversation up now, I'd love to hear from you, Kate, top tips for building a vibrant online community. One of the things that I'm really focused on is the fact that we don't want this to feel like even more work for really small teams. And so it's all about making sure that it actually is efficient internally. So what are your top tips for a small team to be building an online vibrant community?
Okay, 3 things that I'd like to share. Firstly, give them a software, make sure they have somewhere online that they can actually build this community. It's really hard, and it can be kind of, a little bit demotivating if you're trying loads of activities and you're organizing events, but you're doing everything via email and spreadsheets, and you don't have somewhere to show the evidence of this community growing and becoming more vibrant. So definitely some decent system to be able to manage that community. Secondly, I think try and think of a few key activities that you're going to run during a year. And without being too ambitious, I would suggest that some form of event is a good idea. And that could be an online webinar, or it could be as simple as a little pub meetup drinks. It doesn't have to be a huge dinner or a ball or anything fancy. It can just be something quite easy to organize. Put a couple of £100 behind the bar at a pub that that people can get to easily, for example. And the reason I say that is I think event registrations is a transactional process, and people are very comfortable with the idea that they're going to register on your community and upload information about their profiles in return for the benefit of getting an event ticket and attending an event. And they understand that exchange of data for the return that they get. And it does help to get registrations. Basically, it's a transactional thing. And then thirdly, I think you need to have this mindset approach. And we've mentioned this earlier. Building communities and keeping them engaged is not something that will necessarily happen in your sleep as much as we'd love it to. So you do need to have personality types and I guess a network of people who are happy to contribute. And we're not talking about daily posts and stuff all the time, but a piece of news content or an interesting email once every couple of months, it is going to help. People, you're not expecting your alumni or your parents or your former staff to come back and interact with you every single day in a community, but it would be nice that they feel that there's something new for them to read or digest every few months. So having that ability to take interesting stuff that's happening in the school or interesting stuff that's happening amongst your alumni or amongst your parent base and sharing that is important for building that vibrancy long term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if it's feeling overwhelming, starting small but doing it regularly is a great way to do it, isn't it? And then building up once you're seeing what people are responding to.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for your time today, Kate. It's been really interesting to talk about this. And what I love is that we've hardly really talked about techie database stuff at all. This is about people. This is about people
Absolutely.
And human relationships,
Absolutely.
Human communities. And it's all about that mindset, isn't it? About kind of building that regular approach to creating content and then having the software that can make it super easy for you.
Yeah, exactly. And the longevity and permanence and the fact that once you've got systems and processes in place, you can then hand that down to anyone to inherit. Yes. And you've built that long-term kind of future-proofed home for the school that's sort of beyond the school gates.
Absolutely. Future-proofing online communities. I love it. Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Juliet. It's been really a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to the Independent School Podcast, the podcast that helps senior leaders in private schools to think and act more strategically, both because they want to secure the future of their school and because they want to help build a more equal and just world. You can listen in everywhere that podcasts are available. And if you want to catch up on previous episodes or follow any of the links that I've mentioned today, just head over to www.consultjuliet.co.uk/podcast.